Amazon warehouse workers in New York made history this month by voting for a union. Starbucks and Apple employees are also looking to form unions. Is this trend going to change the lives of America's workforce? I sit down with one of the nation's leading labor union experts, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
After Christian Smalls was fired 2 years ago from an Amazon warehouse in New York City, following his participation in a walkout related to the company's pandemic response, Amazon didn't know that Smart, who was characterized by the company as, quote, not smart or articulate, quote, would lead the warehouse's first union election. The Staten Island's warehouse, in a campaign led by Smalls, voted overwhelmingly in favor of unionizing with Amazon Labor Union. The grassroots labor organization started by Smalls and other current and former Amazon employees. The move marks the first time a group of U.S. workers have successfully voted to form a union in Amazon's 27-year history. What does this mean for the future of Amazon and other large employers like Starbucks and even Apple? Today, I'm sitting down with David Madland, Senior Fellow at Center for American Progress. He is a Senior Advisor on the American Worker Project. David also has a new book out, Reunion: How Bold Labor Reforms Can Repair, Revitalize, and Reunite the United States. Good morning and welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, David, this Amazon unionization, first in 27 years, I just want to ask you, how surprised were you with the outcome of that vote?
It's a big deal. You mentioned that not just at Amazon, but just generally our laws make it really hard to join a union, that workers have a long struggle to go through to get it. So it's surprising in one way, but on the other hand, there's sort of a number of factors that make me say, of course, this should be happening. Workers are concerned about their treatment. They were considered essential workers, yet they struggled through really poor working conditions while their, boss or CEO had record profits. So it's both a surprise, but about time as well.
So this labor union, started by Christian Smalls and some other former and current Amazon employees, it's described in the media as grassroots. It's not affiliated with any of the large labor unions that have been around for decades. So again, the question is, how could this organization that doesn't have the political clout, doesn't have the traditional resources that some of the big unions like the Teamsters have, how were they successful when we see a similar effort in Alabama at an Amazon plant failed?
Well, there's a lot of factors, and I think the most important and the most successful campaigns, like the one in Staten Island at Amazon warehouse, are based on workers talking to each other. And that really was the core of this effort, was that workers were, it wasn't some, union seen as an outside force, but it was truly the workers talking with each other, saying, we can improve our working conditions. We're not being treated with respect. We're not having the safe working conditions we deserve, or being, and so there's an authenticity that comes with that kind of communication. And that's true. Traditional unions also do that kind of thing. That is similar to what is happening in Alabama. So that is not the only thing that matters, but it is by far the most important thing.
And we know that the funding that Smalls was able to accumulate was really from a crowdfunding source. He actually used a GoFundMe account to raise the money, and what they raised was pitted against $4.3 million or so that Amazon used to oppose the effort, kind of showing in this David and Goliath fight that it didn't matter that they were the little guy.
Yeah, well, the little guy has, I think, a couple of things going for him right now. One is, this crowdfunding showed how there's widespread public support for unions right now, higher public support for unions than there's been in many, many decades. More workers say they would like to join a union than have almost in any time in history. More than half of workers say they would like to join a union. So those give the David significant force. The other thing that helps David, the little guy, is that the Biden administration, the President Biden, is very much committed to ensuring that workers have rights. Now, our laws are broken and don't let workers have the rights they really need, but at least the ones that are on the books are really going to be enforced under this administration. And that has been also important so that workers don't feel totally on their own.
And we know that President Biden and his administration applauded the efforts of Christian Smalls and the other workers who were successful with respect to this vote. But let's talk a little, David, about this, where we are with labor unions. You said right now there's all-time support amongst workers for unions, but that hasn't always been the case. In the not-so-recent past, I know the unions were not favored, and membership had dropped exponentially for most labor unions across the country. Give us a little sense about what has happened over the last decade with labor unions.
Yeah, well, at some level, the story is really bleak for labor unions right now. They're at the low point. Only 6% of private sector workers are part of unions, which is the lowest almost in history, lower than before the 1930s law gave workers the right to join a union. So we're really struggling right now. But on the other hand, there's sort of this double-edged sword where there's growing public support and growing political support for changing the rules to actually enable workers to more fairly and freely join unions. That's one of the things this Amazon campaigns have highlighted is, especially the Bessemer, Alabama example where they had an election, but the election was seen as unfair because, for example, the company posted a mailbox inside their facility that you were supposed to vote at, which potentially made the workers question the fairness of the election. So I think that duality is really the way to see the fate of the labor movement right now.
And there were some legal cases that were decided in the last decade, too, that also were very harmful to unions as it relates to dues. Talk some about that, because I know here in California, some of the big unions were really impacted by that Supreme Court decision about how dues were or could be collected by unions.
Yes, well, the biggest Supreme Court case in recent years was this so-called Janus case and this was about public sector unions, which there's a slightly different set of laws than the private sector unions, but where public sector unions couldn't charge fees for the workers that were covered by a collective bargaining agreement that sort of benefited from the union's higher wages and pensions and health care and the like, but they couldn't charge it. And so that facilitated a lot more workers being able to free ride, and that has certainly hindered unions' financial support, but also their broader membership. And that's just one example. I don't want to bore your listeners with but there's been decades and decades of similar kinds of court cases, especially as employers have become more and more aggressive in their tactics to fight unions. Just to give a little bit of flavor, the studies show that about 40% of employers violate the law when workers try to organize and, for example, fire workers. But the penalties are so weak that there's no financial penalty. The most an employer might have to do is reinstate the worker and pay them their back wages, minus anything the worker earned in the meantime, because they probably had to get another job. And then they have to post a notice, that these notices that employers call their hunting license, because it's just sort of, a drop in the bucket and no real impact on hindering their anti-union activities.
Why, David, over the last decade or so, do we see this huge drop, as you just identified, with respect to private unions, down to 6% of employees that work for private companies? I don't mean private unions, but I mean, you said 6% of private employees are a part of a union. How do we get to such a low number?
Well, we got there largely by the strong fighting by employers against unions that, the Amazon and Starbucks, et cetera, are highlighting, but also by allowing our laws to wither away and not provide any protections for workers. So it's this double fight against workers. Laws don't help them. Employers are crushing them, and they have relatively little power on their own. The economy has also changed so that employers are more vulnerable. We've gone towards a more cutthroat version of capitalism over recent decades, where your work job is, for example, more likely to be offshore, meaning the employer has greater ability to threaten you. Companies have so-called fissured their workplace, where more workers are independent contractors or subcontractors, and so it's harder to negotiate with the real lead firm that has the power in the industry. So there's a whole host of things. The economy, the politics, and the employers have changed, and really that's the highlights why we need to change the laws to address the way the world has changed in recent years.
And I remember several years ago, lots of friends who live in the Midwest and in the South talking about, their states being right-to-work states. So we went through this period where states were proudly promoting that they didn't, their employers, and most of their employers were not union employers. Is that still, a badge of honor for states to claim to be right-to-work states? And what does that really mean?
Yeah, so the right to work has a really troubled and bad history, as you may be aware. So in the 1940s, the Congress changed the law to allow states to go, quote, so-called right to work, which is not that. It basically means that you can workers don't have to pay the cost of joining a union, so there's more free riding. And when Congress allowed states to do that, basically the whole former Confederacy went right to work because they were afraid of black and white workers joining together. And so that was sort of how most of the country was for decades and decades. All the South was right to work, and the rest of the country was, unions had more rights. But in the 2000s, as Republicans became more and more aggressive, once Republicans got to power in states, especially starting with Scott Walker in Wisconsin, they changed the rules and said, you know what, if we weaken unions, we can have greater ability to do whatever we want. There's going to be fewer political opponents to our agenda to cut taxes on the rich, to deregulate companies so they don't have to provide safe workplaces. And so it's become more and more political in states where there's a rampant fight. So not only are the federal laws weak, but then states where, Republicans have had a lot of power, they've gone after unions with the gloves off.
Yeah, and we know that unions traditionally have had a lot of power in elections because they can raise substantial dollars, and they've been able to support candidates, and they've been a driving force in a lot of political races, a lot of close races, supporting in many cases Democrats, but also supporting Republican candidates as well. Let's talk more about this Amazon, what happened in Staten Island. How likely is it that this is going to have a ripple effect throughout, Amazon warehouses? We know they're the second largest employer in the United States. So are we likely to see the entirety of Amazon become unionized?
Well, there's a big hope that this is the spark because, it's the first successful campaign to join a union at an Amazon facility in the United States. There are a handful of other cases where there are ongoing efforts. Another one in Staten Island, actually, I think this week is going to have a vote. And they're still recounting the votes in Bessemer, Alabama, because they had to rerun that election, and now it's sort of so close and contested about where that went. So there's a number of facilities that are in active campaigns. And I also think the more you see success, the more it spreads. So especially if these Staten Island workers are able to get a contract, because the point of joining a union is to then get a collective bargaining agreement that improves your working conditions. And that's a big step, unfortunately. Again, our laws make that a very hard process. So I think the Staten Island victory is a potential spark, but so could if they're successful at getting a collective bargaining agreement.
So, do you think this little grassroots labor union that Christian Smalls and others formed will be able to negotiate this contract, this collective bargaining agreement, without bringing in one of the big unions like the Teamsters or one of the other bigger established organizations?
We'll see. Now, the history of the labor movement is this really nice and interesting sort of conversation between the grassroots and then the institution, because you need both. You need the grassroots energy and excitement and freedom combined with the more institutional structure and power and knowledge. And there's this sort of long history of you need a little of each. And there are certainly the independent union at Staten Island is also in conversations with the institutional unions and trying to understand what their right moves should be. Exactly where that goes, again, I want to highlight the deck is really stacked against them. It's going to be a hard hurdle. So only 1 in 7 organizing campaigns in the U.S. actually gets a collective bargaining agreement within a year. And so
so you're saying unions, even 1 in 7 that are successful in getting the vote.
That's where I was going to go. So no, once they win the election, then only about half actually get to the collective bargaining agreement within a year. So the first is the hurdle. It's winning the election, big deal. That's not everyone gets that far. Now they're here. There's roughly a 50-50 shot within a year.
But hold on, before we talk about what happens next, what happens to the other half that gets the vote and they don't get to a contract within a year? Does the vote just not count and they just go back to business as usual?
Well, so that's what happens is they can continue to negotiate, but at some point, often workers get dejected. They've been doing this for year and year, and they sort of lose out, which is unfortunately why employers delay and delay. And you can see that already with Amazon. They're actually contesting the Staten Island victory, even though it was a clear-cut victory. They're using sort of the legal delay tactics they have to draw out the process. So yes, sometimes workers fight for years or even decades. Other times they give up because they say this is futile. Now, there's plenty of policy changes that would actually make that much more likely that workers and employers could come to an agreement much more quickly.
So let's talk about the 50% that do get a contract. What is that process like now for Amazon and this little labor union to get to that collective bargaining agreement?
Well, it's a negotiation. The beauty of unions and collective bargaining is they give some greater power for workers to sit at a more even playing field with their employer when they discuss things. Now, neither the union nor the employer are necessarily 100% right. The thing is, there's a back and forth. And hey, we like slightly better, safer working conditions, and we think this is the way to go. And then the employer can say, actually, we think if we did this, and then they can have a back and forth. Okay, we can raise your wages and reduce your schedule and make it more predictable in this way. And then they can come and find something that, an outside party, like this is the difference between setting a minimum wage, for example, or OSHA, is that the legal standards are important, but they won't necessarily have the on-the-ground feeling for what is most important for those workers and employers and come to a creative solution.
So we know that some of the demands that have been identified in the public are things like higher wages, job security, better working conditions, longer breaks, funding for transportation, even warehouse workers getting some actual shares of stock in the company. How likely is that laundry list of demands going to be accepted by, the Amazon management team?
Well, I don't think we know that. What we do know is that the history of labor unions are when workers join together, they are much more likely to get higher wages. Estimates are around 13% higher than similar non-union workers. They're more likely to get health benefits and retirement benefits and have much better schedules. So generally, workers who join together are able to get more. There's in this individual case, it's as you mentioned, it's a David and Goliath, and so they do have their work cut out for them. But if they're able to succeed, not only will they be setting an important, improvement in working conditions for themselves, but they potentially have the ability to transform Amazon and the country. And that's one of the things that I think is often missed in the debate, is how much this matters for all of us. Because for decades, wages have been stagnant in this country, and we've had a growing, inequality with those at the top doing well and the rest of us not doing particularly well. And when unions are stronger, those conditions are dramatically different. So too is our democracy, because unions help workers turn out to vote. They're much more likely to turn out to vote. They also hold politicians accountable. Politicians are much more likely to support policies that workers actually support when unions are stronger. And you have this moment in the country where the public is frustrated and dejected, and some even turning to, almost totalitarian views, because they don't think the politicians are doing enough to help them out. And so I really think that stronger labor unions are one of the most important solutions to the kind of challenges we face in our country.
So Amazon, as you said, they're stalling. They're saying that they may challenge the vote. They're suggesting that the National Labor Relations Board somehow tilted the scales in favor of the workers. So they're making all of these allegations and noise to, as you said, to use every option that they have to delay the collective bargaining negotiation process. But one of the things they're also saying is, look, we already pay our employees well above the $15 minimum wage that we see some cities like Los Angeles and Seattle and other cities have. And Apple, I know in some of the reports, their workers say we want to make $30 an hour. So if you were to, kind of think about where the wages would end up, you said 13% higher for union workers, where might that Amazon warehouse wage end up in a negotiated contract? Is it $30 an hour? Is it $35 an hour?
Sure, it's possible. And the thing about these kind of negotiations, it is often not just the minimums that are important, that there's often a progression, an ability to continue to have a career. Because the way Amazon works currently, yes, their pay is better than a lot of firms, but their turnover is incredibly high. They burn through workers because the job isn't particularly sustainable. Also, people worry about the safety of the job as well. And so often, yes, it's maybe the minimums don't raise that much, but there'll be an ability for more seasoned, experienced, and skilled workers to have a career there where they can earn a living wage that lets them put their kids through school and the like. And that is, I think, the ultimate hope, but it's really hard to predict exactly where they're going to end up.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up about the churn rate that Amazon has. And I read that someplace, I don't know, the average length of employment is a month or some incredibly low number, that their whole business model is based on just bringing folks in and turning them out. Just the attrition rate was just astronomical. And so I wonder if their business model has been based on, we bring you in, we give you this, what appears to be attractive wage that's higher than most companies probably are paying, $20, $25 an hour. But, the working conditions are poor. You're only going to be here 30, 60, 90 days at best, and then we're going to start this process all over. How does a company like that, that's been operating with that business model, adjust to a model that says, wait a minute, once this contract is in place, you can't fire that person for that small infraction that you might have used to get rid of people in the past?
Well, there's, a long history of this, what some people would call a high road model of how you compete based on higher wages. And the sort of the classic example is you will compare sort of the history of Walmart versus its competitor Costco. And both are financially successful firms. They compete, but one competes on higher wages and maintaining its workers, and the other on the sort of more of a churn kind of model. And I think the ultimate goal of unions is to reduce the churn and force this competition on a high wage model. There's plenty of evidence that it can succeed, but unfortunately, and Amazon's not alone in this very high turnover. Many, in fact, I don't know, it's maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but most low wage employers, that's in some ways their model. Fast food, you think of, or the gig drivers, the turnover is just incredibly high. And one of the dynamics that's different right now is because the labor market is so tight that the workers they're less worried about being churned through because it's not as easy for the employer to get new replacements. And that's, an important difference right now and why workers have a little bit more leverage than they normally do.
What do you think this vote, the successful vote, although, as you said, hasn't gotten to the contract part yet, but companies like Walmart, like McDonald's, they were targeted. We've seen years of employees targeting those companies, asking for higher wages, trying to unionize, and the companies have been pretty successful in fighting the employees. Does this change the game even for those companies?
Well, we'll see, and that's where, you mentioned this history. There's been whatever the biggest sort of company at the moment is, there's often a lot of attention to how workers are doing there and their efforts to join a union. And unfortunately, as we highlighted in this discussion, the laws make it really hard so that they haven't necessarily succeeded at Walmart recently or McDonald's, although some really important policy, for example, in McDonald's, there's a bill in California that would create what's called a sectoral council that would bring workers and the McDonald's employers and the franchises and the franchisors together to sort of discuss policies, it's not a unionization exactly effort, but it is a way to raise standards across the industry and give the workers a voice. And I think that's an important step that is also happening. So there's the kind of grassroots on the ground models that we're seeing in Amazon and Starbucks, but there's also some policy models that potentially could also be a way to give the workers more power and voice and transform industries.
So, David, you said that there is all-time high support amongst the American people for unions. But I remember several years ago reading some studies showing that younger employees were anti-unions, that they did not want to be in a unionized workplace, that they saw it as an obstacle to higher promotions and management positions. And they thought of unions as kind of being, like something that happened in the 50s or 60s, but wasn't a part of what they wanted for their own workplaces. Has that attitude changed, particularly among workers under, say, 40 or 30 years old?
One of the, I think, important dynamics, and you're really seeing this play out in Starbucks and Amazon, is that young people today are the most pro-union of any generation. It's really amazing. Their levels of support are significantly higher than, for example, baby boomers. And what I think is important is they don't also have the kind of history of a lived experience of joining a union. What I think is driving their strong support for unions is they've entered a labor market and they don't have these sort of false misconceptions that if they start, that they can work hard and succeed, and that's the only way to succeed. They, came of age during the Great Recession and then the pandemic, and they see that it's a very precarious world out there, and unless they join together, no one else is necessarily going to step up and help them out, that they need to take action in their own hands. So they have this, I think, real economic incentive, but also an ideological orientation that has made young people, it's really amazing. And that's, I think, where you could see, one of the reasons you could see these sort of organizing efforts really take off is that there's just the young people who are starting off in their careers really have the chance to transform a lot of industries right now.
Let's talk a little about your book, David, Reunion, How Bold Labor Reforms Can Repair, Revitalize, and Reunite the United States. I know you are obviously very pro-union, but you say that the union, the way we think about unions in this country is flawed, and we need to reimagine how unions operate. Talk some about what is the way that you think unions should operate in this country that would be the most advantageous to workers.
Yeah, so one of the big changes I talk about is thinking about the way we bargain and changing that. So currently we bargain at just worksite by worksite level. And you think of the Staten Island workers at Amazon, where they're now going to bargain with this really big firm. And that creates a lot of conditions that are a challenge. So if they succeed, they're going to have higher wages than their colleagues, which makes them a target. And that's one of the reasons that Amazon or any company would sort of fight against them. Whereas most other countries, and in the past when unions were stronger in the U.S., we bargain on a much broader base, especially for a whole industry, so that all firms in the industry would have a similar set of standards and then would actually have to compete based on higher productivity. And this is ultimately the kind of model that succeeded for decades in the auto industry in the U.S. This really was what helped build the middle class. And so I talk a lot about how we can move towards that from this base where unions are, only 6% in the private sector, and our laws channel all bargaining towards this very, very narrow level.
So under your model, a retailer like Amazon, the negotiation wouldn't be between that Staten Island union and that management team. It would be negotiations that would cover all employees that work in retail stores like Amazon. So that one collective bargaining agreement would apply to the Walmarts and the Costcos and the other retailers?
Yeah, the similar competitors in the similar labor market would be covered, so that the unions that represent those workers would sit at a table with the employers and they would bargain, and they would set a set of minimum standards. There would also likely be additional kind of bargaining at the work site. So there might be a little bit of tweak that this is important at this particular work site, and this additional change is important at this other site. But the broad standards would be set as minimums and would be similar across the whole spectrum. And, that is, I think, one of the, as I mentioned, it's important for the way firms then compete based on productivity. It's also very important for the workers, and not just that they tend to get higher wages and benefits, but also this reduces discrimination significantly, because when standards are the same, whether a worker is black, white, Hispanic, or gay, straight, they're all at a floor, and the research is really clear that this is a very strong equalizing effect. And that is among the things, this is where, again, I highlight the importance of unions to all of us. And that's the kind of change I think, this country needs.
How was that accomplished, David, with respect to the autos? Because I do think about the autos and the fact that, the Ford and GM, they all had union. They were all union shops, all the U.S. car manufacturers. When you think, and you talk about that middle class, Detroit, and those cities that, were heavily, where there were lots of auto plants, you had this really vibrant middle class. Was that achieved by the car companies and the unions coming together on their own, or was there some legislation that facilitated that?
It was largely on their own. The unions and the employers came together, but what made it possible was that the unions represented 100% of the workers in the industry, so they had a lot of power. And so that's why I'm thinking of, unions are starting now at 6% density. And we also don't necessarily want to go through the decades and decades of fighting and struggle that workers had to do to achieve that. We want to have quicker and better results. And so that's why at one level, yes, workers have the potential to achieve this on their own, but it's a rare confluence. 100% density is a very hard thing to achieve. And so, and to be clear, this wasn't just the auto industry. Steel industry had something similar, trucking, but it took near 100% union density, and that is something that only a few industries had. It also was very fragile because something changes in the industry and it goes away. A new competitor in the auto industry, the parts manufacturers on the side, or the foreign competitors coming into the South, and then the whole bargain erodes, and then you get this weaker devolution towards this individual level bargaining just to hold on to what you got. And so I'm hoping that we can learn our lesson that this was a very successful strategy, but it shouldn't take 100% union density to achieve.
Well, I'm thinking now, like, given the climate that we are in, this highly partisan climate that we're in, what would it take for that to happen in this moment, in this moment of history that we find ourselves? I can't imagine the Amazons of the world getting together with the Walmarts and the Costcos and the Targets saying, let's, all come to the bargaining table with all of our workers.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot, and I'm not naive about that. But I think we are also at a moment where so many things we didn't think are possible are. This is both a frightening and an opportunistic moment. And what I think is different, and you mentioned the partisanship. Sure, we have tremendous differences across party, and generally, as I highlighted, too many Republican politicians have attacked unions, but the general public support unions across party. This is not just a Democrat support. Republican mainstream voters support unions. And even there was one bill in Congress called the PRO Act, which is a big step forward, that passed the House last year, I believe, and it had Republican support, not overwhelming, only a handful of Republicans, but anything that gets both Democrats and even a few Republicans these days is remarkably bipartisan. So there is potential here. It's not, we're not going to get there immediately, but the facts on the ground, I think, also are important. The more workers take action, the more activists, this creates not only that kind of conversation we're having, but it also changes the way the world operates, so that the firms are going to have to deal with this. It's not that they're going to voluntarily choose to, but when workers are in motion and the politics and the policies push them, that's, I think, when you see the most action. Because now I'm going to go on a little bit long, and I apologize for that. But when I highlighted that, in Detroit, it was the workers and the unions that got together almost independently. That's only partly true. Actually, there were World War II, there were these war labor boards, so the auto firms were actually doing a lot of war production. And those boards encouraged union density that then spilled over and gave the workers the power then to bargain. So it's not this independence plus the sort of policy and political environment that I think really sets the table for workers to succeed in their efforts.
And you mentioned something about discrimination and how unions help reduce the chances of discrimination that can happen in workplaces based on race, based on gender, based on age. If the Staten Island union is successful in getting a collective bargaining agreement and say they are able to negotiate higher wages for the workers at that Staten Island plant, better break times, maybe better health benefits, other retirement benefits, other benefits that typically are part of those collective bargaining agreements. What's going to happen for the Amazon warehouse that's 30 miles away in the state of New York? And now the Staten Island folks are making $27 an hour and overtime, a time and a half, and they have better health insurance and a fantastic 401k plan. And the guys 30 miles away and women who now are making $18, $20 an hour, how does Amazon, continue to pay less 30 miles down the road than what it's paying in the Staten Island warehouse?
Well, companies often don't. And this is where what the workers that unionize are able to negotiate often spreads throughout the rest of the firm as well as the economy. That's the sort of one of the broader benefits of unions. It's not just union members who benefit, it's all of us in this, but that happens most when unions have greater strength. So right now it's 6%. There's relatively little of that sort of spreading out happening, but when they were stronger, there was much more. In fact, we talked about the auto industry, their standards really permeated throughout the entire economy, and that benefited most everyone. In contrast, now it's, the hope is that they'll pay higher wages. The fear, though, is that they become a target, that one warehouse that has negotiated for higher wages, they're a little potentially vulnerable. Unless Amazon chooses to raise wages for all workers, they could also say, hey, we're going to make it really tough on this firm, and maybe we don't need this warehouse as much as we did. Maybe we can divert to other places. And those.
So when you say a target, you mean Amazon may close that warehouse? Can they do that?
It's possible that those kind of things have happened. You mentioned, earlier some other firms, Walmart or Exact, and then when workers unionized, that particular shop sometimes got closed. Again, the laws are supposed to prevent that from happening, but they don't really, because employers can often find a quote unquote business reason for closing the shop. And this is also one of the reasons I advocate for this broader kind of bargaining, because the workers at this individual shop feel really vulnerable potentially when you're just negotiating for yourself. But that's also, I want to highlight a little bit of something that's, I think, important that's happening. The other big unionization effort is at Starbucks. And there's more happening. Amazon, there's a lot. There's at least five shops or so, but Starbucks, it's, we're in dozens now in the fast, and they potentially will also change the facts on the ground and make it so that you can't just close this one little shop, but there's a bunch you have to deal with.
So the Starbucks, have they had successful votes like that Amazon warehouse? Yeah,
Starbucks have had they've had a number of successful unionization votes. Again, they haven't gotten to a contract yet, but it's a similar time frame. They've just won, and there's a number of others that are happening. But I think there's, maybe a dozen successful. That's if I'm wrong on that, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. There's been a lot recently.
Given, I don't know how many Starbucks there are, maybe 4,000 or 5,000, maybe 10. I'm not even sure how many, but does that vote have to take place at every little Starbucks and every corner in this country?
Yes, now that's the way our law works, which again is a very slow and cumbersome process, but that's the way the law operates. And in fact, in a strange thing, Starbucks actually challenged that and said, wait, that doesn't make any sense. But the NLRB said, well, that's actually the way our laws operate, and that's the way things work. But yes, ideally, you'd want to, the unions, it's both an easier process to unionize if you did, it's so much effort to organize 3 or 4 workers at one firm at one little Starbucks operation. And then again, the bargaining isn't necessarily the most efficient. Why does it, why are you bargaining for this?
That little Starbucks on the corner has to then do a collective bargaining agreement across every Starbucks in this country?
Potentially. But again, now if there's enough workers that unionize, they could change the dynamics, and they could say, we want to bargain in a different way. And the firm could say, okay, we will do that. We will bargain for all of the Starbucks in Buffalo, New York, or however. But generally, the law doesn't encourage or facilitate that.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, these laws, no one anticipated an Amazon, obviously. No one anticipated Amazon becoming so critical to all of our lives, which happened during the pandemic. And these laws were written well before we had a Starbucks on every corner. So any chances that these laws are going to get amended to catch up to where we are in terms of how workplaces look today?
Oh, that's a really tough question. And unfortunately, our Congress is almost broken, and passing anything is a huge, huge challenge. And so I don't know. The signs of optimism, again, are public support. 2/3 of the public support unions. That's, not 2/3 of the public doesn't support anything. That is an incredibly high number. There's broad support. More and more politicians are recognizing the need for unions. And again, that crosses party lines. It's primarily Democrats, but also a growing number of Republican elected officials are recognizing unions are an essential solution to our problems in this country. So there is, and the last thing I think that's really important is not just that it's public opinion. The very few times the public has been able to vote directly on unions, these are sort of one-off things, like whether we should have right to work in our state, or whether public sector workers should have the right to unionize. In Ohio, there was referendums 5-10 years ago in Ohio, West Virginia, on these kind of things, and the public, or Missouri on right to work, for example, the public says we support the unions. Whenever they have a chance, they'll support the unions. And so there is this, if we could get to a place where our democracy actually responded to the will of the people, yes, there's an opportunity here.
Wow. Well, we got to leave it there. Thank you, David. So fascinating. Obviously, we're going to be watching what happens with Amazon as more votes are taking place in other plants, and this negotiated contract with the Staten Island plant hopefully continues to move forward on some track. And Starbucks, that's exciting to hear that they are even further down the road than Amazon is. So maybe we'll start to see some contracts coming out of those votes that have taken place already. Lots to think about, and as you said, lots to be optimistic about in terms of American workers. And workers are more powerful today than they've been in a very long time as a result of the pandemic. So hopefully that power translates into something that's sustainable. Again, thank you so much. Your book is, again, Reunion: How Bold Labor Reforms Can Repair, Revitalize, and Reunite the United States. And we definitely need to be reunited at this point. Again, thank you, David, for sitting down with me.
Thanks very much for having me.
Wow, so much happening around unions. And I don't know about you, but I grew up in St. Louis, and I lived in a community where so many of the individuals that were in my community were parts of unions. And I had family members that lived in Detroit and worked in Detroit. So there were plants, auto plants in Missouri, auto plants in Detroit, plants spread throughout the Midwest, and most of us probably grew up in households where our family members, either directly or we had family members that were, in our circles that belonged to unions. So we know how powerful those unions have been throughout our history in creating that vibrant middle class. So I'm encouraged. Again, what has happened at Amazon clearly can happen in big companies across this country. And it's my words to live by. Never underestimate the power of one individual to make a difference. We got to give Christian Smalls a lot of credit. This guy was fired from Amazon. He was demonized by the management team at Amazon, yet he did not give up. He persisted, and he was able to galvanize workers, former and existing workers in that Staten Island plant, and they held that vote and they won. So we're going to, cheer him on as he goes through that next phase, that very difficult phase of now negotiating that collective bargaining agreement. But he's already proven that David can succeed, even when he is facing the biggest Goliath like Amazon. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.